Una vez creí que mis años dorados estaban destinados a un declive silencioso, pero solo recientemente comprendí la profunda verdad de ese miedo. Me llamo Henry Thorndike. Tengo 72 años y resido en una casa que ya no siento como mía. La áspera brisa de Plymouth sacudía los cristales mientras estaba sentado en mi sillón, contemplando la fotografía de Vivian. Han pasado 5 años desde que la enfermedad la arrebató, pero el dolor de su ausencia nunca desaparece del todo. Cada rincón de este lugar guarda sus preciados recuerdos. Las elegantes cortinas de terciopelo que seleccionó meticulosamente. La colección de delicadas figuras de porcelana sobre nuestra repisa. El otrora vibrante jardín de rosas, ahora sucumbiendo lentamente al abandono bajo mi mano inexperta. «Necesitas algo de distracción, padre», comentó Elliot una vez durante una de sus escasas visitas. «¿Por qué no vendes la propiedad? Es demasiado grande para una sola persona». Descarté su sugerencia. Desprendernos de la casa que Vivian y yo habíamos construido con tanto esmero con los ahorros de 2 décadas como ingeniero químico. ¿Una casa donde cada elemento se eligió en conjunto? No, eso era simplemente inconcebible. Nuestra majestuosa residencia victoriana, enclavada en el distrito histórico de Plymouth, era mi orgullo eterno. Contaba con 3 dormitorios, una espaciosa sala común con chimenea, un cómodo estudio lleno de mis libros de química y las entrañables novelas de Vivian, y una cocina con vistas al jardín. Todo fue elegido y arreglado con profundo cariño. 40 años atrás, cuando intercambiamos votos, una casa así parecía un sueño imposible. Suspiré, tomando mi té, que se había enfriado. Me dolían las articulaciones. El clima estaba cambiando. Últimamente, pensaba cada vez más en mi hijo. Elliot nunca había sido un niño especialmente cariñoso, más lógico que tierno. Vivian solía comentar que había heredado mi mente analítica, pero no su espíritu bondadoso. Le ofrecimos todas las ventajas posibles, una sólida educación y apoyo profesional temprano. Ahora es un próspero experto financiero, pero nuestra relación se formalizó cada año. Esto cambió hace aproximadamente 3 años cuando se casó con Regina Baster. Recuerdo sus nupcias, ostentosas, extravagantes, elaboradas. Aunque sabía que habían contraído una deuda considerable para impresionar a la élite de Plymouth. Regina provenía de un linaje prominente, pero, como descubrí más tarde, prácticamente no poseía riquezas reales. Su padre había malgastado una fortuna en una empresa fallida, y su madre estaba demasiado acostumbrada al lujo como para adaptarse a las nuevas circunstancias. «Viene de buena familia, padre», declaró Elliot entonces, como si eso lo explicara todo. Intuí cierta falsedad en Regina, pero me mordí la lengua. Vivian siempre decía que juzgaba demasiado a los demás, así que decidí darle una oportunidad justa a mi nuera. Quizás ese fue mi grave error. Después de la ceremonia, las visitas de Elliot se hicieron aún más escasas, una vez al mes, con suerte. Siempre llegaba tarde, siempre parecía cumplir con una obligación en lugar de visitar a su padre. Regina me ofreció su sonrisa impecable, pero su mirada permaneció distante mientras observaba mi casa. «Es tan encantadora. Una estética tan clásica», comentó, pasando un dedo por los muebles antiguos que había heredado de mis padres. «¿Alguna vez has considerado modernizarla, Henry?» «Vivian lo prefería así», respondía cada vez. «Yo también». Regina simplemente apretó los labios y miró a Elliot. Una vez los oí conversar en el patio, creyendo que estaba en la biblioteca. «Esta finca vale una suma considerable, sobre todo con un terreno tan grande», afirmó Regina. «Imagina lo que podríamos lograr con ese capital». «Mi padre jamás consentiría en vender», respondió Elliot. «Está demasiado dedicado a este lugar. No está rejuveneciendo», observó Regina con un peculiar tono de expectación en la voz. «Tarde o temprano necesitará ayuda». Me retiré en silencio a la biblioteca, reflexionando sobre lo que había oído. Una inquietante frialdad me recorrió la espalda. ¿Estaban anticipando mi fragilidad o mi fallecimiento para adquirir la propiedad? La idea era demasiado angustiosa, e intenté desterrarla de mis pensamientos. Pero la vida, como siempre, sufría sus propios cambios. Un día de marzo, mientras cuidaba el jardín, intentando arreglar los rosales de Vivian, el mundo giró bruscamente ante mis ojos. Mi brazo derecho dejó de responder y mi lengua se volvió lenta y poco cooperativa. Lo último que recuerdo antes de perder el conocimiento fueron las flores carmesí, tan parecidas a las que mi esposa adoraba. Desperté en el centro médico. Microderrame cerebral, explicó el médico. No es mortal, pero es una clara advertencia. Debe cuidarse. Tome sus medicamentos recetados. Evite el estrés excesivo. Eché apareció 2 horas después de mi llamada, con aspecto preocupado y excepcionalmente atento. Escuchó al experto médico, hizo algunas preguntas y luego se volvió hacia mí. Padre, no puede quedarse solo. No tengo nada grave, argumenté, aunque mi habla aún estaba algo alterada. Solo necesito tomar mis medicamentos. No, esto es grave. ¿Y si vuelve a ocurrir cuando no hay nadie? Eché parecía genuinamente preocupado, y me conmovió. ¿Sabe qué? Regina y yo nos mudaremos temporalmente con usted. Es una vivienda espaciosa, con espacio de sobra para todos. No es necesario, intenté objetar. Tiene sus propias rutinas, su propio piso, lo que le está dejando sin dinero en alquiler. Eché sonrió. Créeme, es una decisión sabia para todos. Ahorraremos dinero en el alquiler y recibirás la atención adecuada. Algo en su actitud me hizo reflexionar, pero estaba demasiado frágil para discutir. Además, la perspectiva de que mi hijo finalmente se preocupara por ti me reconfortaba. De acuerdo, finalmente concedí, pero solo hasta que me sienta mejor. Eché se animó, sacando su móvil. Regina estará encantada. Ayer mismo expresó su preocupación por ti. Dudaba de la sinceridad de la preocupación de Regina, pero guardé silencio. Quizás me equivoqué con ella. Quizás esta circunstancia nos acercaría. 3 días después, me dieron de alta del hospital. Eché me recibió en su flamante Jaguar, un vehículo demasiado caro para un hombre que se quejaba del alto alquiler. Pero, una vez más, guardé silencio. Cuando llegamos a la casa, vi un vehículo de transporte de muebles ya estacionado en la entrada, y Regina, con un traje impecable, nos recibió en la entrada. Henry, exclamó, acercándose para ofrecerme apoyo, aunque yo era perfectamente capaz de caminar sin ayuda. Hemos estado muy ansiosos. Ya te he preparado una habitación. Mi dormitorio. Aclaré, presintiendo que algo no iba bien. Oh, no. Regina miró a Eché. Decidimos que estarías más cómodo en la habitación de invitados más pequeña de la planta principal. No tendrás que subir las escaleras. Soy perfectamente capaz de subir escaleras, protesté. El médico dijo que incluso la actividad física moderada es beneficiosa. Padre, solo te cuidamos. Eché me puso la mano en el hombro. Además, Regina y yo trajimos muchas cosas. Necesitamos el espacio. Quise objetar, declarar que esta era mi vivienda, que el dormitorio principal siempre había sido mío y de Vivian, donde aún se guardaban sus recuerdos, pero en lugar de eso, simplemente asentí. No quería iniciar una discusión el primer día. Realmente poseían muchas cosas. En pocas horas, el equipo de mudanzas había traído tantos contenedores y muebles a la casa que la entrada y la sala de estar parecían un almacén. ¿Por qué necesitas tantas cosas? Pregunté. Dijiste que te mudabas temporalmente. Queremos que te sientas a gusto con nosotros, dijo Eché, evitando mi mirada. Puede que tarde un poco. Me dirigí a mi nueva habitación, la antigua zona de descanso de invitados. Pequeña y estrecha. Mis efectos personales ya se habían trasladado allí. Ropa, algunos libros, cuadros, pero faltaba mucho. ¿Dónde está el resto de mis pertenencias? Pregunté, entrando en la cocina donde Regina estaba organizando una vajilla nueva y desconocida. Las tenemos ordenadamente apiladas en el almacén de arriba, respondió con una sonrisa. No necesitas todo a la vez. Metí las manos en los bolsillos de mi bata. Estas personas, mi hijo y su esposa, acababan de mudarse a mi propiedad y ya estaban dictando dónde debía dormir y qué podía guardar en mi espacio privado. Por la noche, Eché preparó la cena. Para mi asombro, demostró ser un chef muy competente. Nos reunimos alrededor del comedor. Regina hablaba de su trabajo de consultoría en la galería de arte. Eché conversaba sobre inversiones y acciones. Permanecí en silencio, sintiéndome como un extraño en mi propia casa. Padre, comentó Eché de repente, sirviendo bebida en copas. Creo que tenemos que abordar algunos asuntos de organización. ¿Cómo cuáles? Sentí una nueva oleada de cansancio. Verá, mientras estuvo hospitalizado, pagué algunos gastos, luz, agua, internet, y observé que son bastante cuantiosos. Recibo una pensión, respondí. Siempre administro mis propias cuentas. Por supuesto, asintió Elliot rápidamente. Pero quizás debería otorgarme autoridad legal para que pueda ayudarle con sus finanzas si vuelve a enfermar. Ese fue el momento. Examiné a mi hijo con atención. Su expresión solo transmitía solicitud, pero su mirada eludió la mía. Lo consideraré, respondí con cautela. Pero por ahora, soy totalmente capaz de administrar mi propio dinero. Claro, padre, dijo Elliot sonriendo y alzando su copa. Salud. Esa noche, me costó conciliar el sueño durante un buen rato en una habitación desconocida. La cama era incómoda, el colchón demasiado blando para mi espalda. Las voces susurrantes de Elliot y Regina se filtraban por la pared, pero no distinguía las palabras. Me quedé mirando al techo, pensando en Vivian. ¿Qué diría si presenciara todo esto? La imaginé sentada en el borde de la cama con su dulce sonrisa y su mirada astuta. No dejes que te controlen, Henry. Este es nuestro hogar. Pero Vivian se había ido, y podía sentir como el control sobre mi existencia, sobre la morada que tanto amábamos, se me escapaba poco a poco. Y lo más doloroso era que esto ocurría con la complicidad de mi propio hijo. Había pasado un mes desde que Elliot y Regina se mudaron a mi casa, un mes durante el cual comprendí el significado de ser un extraño entre los míos. Cada amanecer, me despertaba sintiéndome como en un hotel, todo familiar y, a la vez, extraño. Mi pequeña habitación se convirtió en mi único refugio. Allí guardaba un retrato de Vivian, algunos libros queridos y un reloj antiguo heredado de mi padre. Todo lo demás, desde mi colección de discos hasta mi ropa de invierno, lo guardaba en cajas y lo enviaba al ático. Para tu tranquilidad, padre, decía Elliot cada vez que intentaba protestar. Esa mañana, me despertó el sonido de una herramienta eléctrica. El reloj marcaba las 7:30, demasiado temprano para obras de reforma. Me puse la bata, salí de la habitación y seguí el ruido. Provenía del estudio, mi estudio, donde se encontraban las estanterías que Vivian y yo habíamos seleccionado de catálogos antiguos. En el umbral, me quedé paralizada al verlo. Obreros con ropa protectora estaban despegando mis estanterías de las paredes, y otros ya estaban instalando estanterías de cristal contemporáneas. Mis libros yacían desordenados en el suelo. ¿Qué está pasando aquí? Mi voz sonaba débil, pero Regina, de pie junto a la ventana con un portadocumentos, se giró. «Ay, Henry, te molestamos». Se acercó a mí con una sonrisa fingida. «Queríamos terminar antes de que te levantaras». ¡Qué grata sorpresa! No podía confiar en mis ojos. ¿Desmantelas mi biblioteca personal sin mi consentimiento y la etiquetan como sorpresa? No desmantelas, sino que la actualizas. Regina hizo un gesto con la mano, señalando las nuevas estanterías. Esos viejos muebles ocupaban demasiado espacio y acumulaban polvo. ¿Entiendes lo perjudicial que es eso para tu bienestar? Y las nuevas unidades parecen modernas y no abarrotan el espacio. ¿Dónde está Elliot? Intenté hablar con calma a pesar de mi furia interior. En su trabajo, tiene una reunión crucial hoy. ¿Sabe de esta? ¿Mejora? Por supuesto que sí, Regina me miró con fingida sorpresa. Fue una idea conjunta. Dijo que no te opondrías porque es por tu propia comodidad. Me giré en silencio y regresé a mi habitación. Me temblaban las manos de rabia impotente. Mi hijo ni siquiera se había molestado en pedirme opinión sobre la redecoración de mi estudio privado. Pasé el resto del día en mi habitación, escuchando los ruidos de la casa al ser trasladada, perforada y reconfigurada. Alrededor de las 3 de la tarde, no pude soportarlo más y salí. El clima era desolador, con nubes grises como las de Plymouth sobre la zona urbana, pero aún no había empezado a llover. Me dirigí al paseo marítimo, donde solía pasear con Vivian. La brisa marina me tranquilizó un poco. Me senté en un banco, observando las olas romper contra la costa rocosa, e intenté ordenar mis pensamientos. ¿Qué estaba pasando en mi casa? ¿Por qué les permitía manejarlo todo como si fuera suyo, no mío? ¿Por qué mi hijo había cambiado tan drásticamente? Henry Torniqueque, ¿de verdad eres tú? Me giré al oír una voz familiar. Frente a mí estaba Oliver Holt, un viejo amigo y abogado al que no había visto en unos 2 años. Una barba canosa, gafas de montura fina, un abrigo grueso de tweed. No había cambiado mucho, salvo unas arrugas más en el rostro. Oliver. Me levanté para estrecharle la mano. ¡Qué encuentro tan inesperado! Solo estoy estirando los huesos, sonrió, sentándose a mi lado. ¿Qué te trae por el puerto con este tiempo? Escapar de mi propia casa, admití con franqueza. Eso suena preocupante, Oliver me observó atentamente. ¿Qué te preocupa? Le conté mi microderrame cerebral, la mudanza de Eché y Regina, y como poco a poco iban tomando el control de la casa. Con cada palabra, me daba cuenta cada vez más de lo absurdo de la situación. Y hoy han decidido modernizar mi biblioteca sin preguntar, Oliver. En mi propia casa. Oliver frunció el ceño. ¿Las escrituras de propiedad siguen a tu nombre? Por supuesto, lo financié todo yo mismo. ¿Pagan algún tipo de alquiler? Negué con la cabeza. Eché se ofreció a ayudar con los gastos, pero sigo cubriendo todo personalmente. Solo dice que están ahorrando dinero al no alquilar un apartamento. Henry, Oliver me puso la mano en el hombro. Como asesor legal y acompañante, te insto a que tengas cuidado. Lo que describes parece un despojo gradual de tu propiedad. Se están aprovechando de tu benevolencia y de tu reciente enfermedad. De ninguna manera, Eché, titubeé, es mi hijo, y por eso confías en él. Oliver suspiró. He presenciado numerosos casos de personas mayores desposeídas por familiares directos. A menudo empieza por problemas de salud y el deseo de ayudar. ¿Qué sugieres? Me sentí atrapada. Bueno, para empezar, nada de poderes notariales, nada de administración de propiedades, nada de acceso a cuentas bancarias. Guarda todos los documentos legales de la casa en un lugar seguro y registra cada acción que realicen sin tu permiso. Fechas, cantidades, escrituras específicas. Asentí, con un escalofrío recorriendo mi espalda. ¿Era mi hijo realmente capaz de semejante comportamiento? ¿O era yo paranoica, percibiendo una conspiración donde solo había preocupación, aunque expresada con tristeza? Henry, no creas que intento crear un conflicto entre tú y tu hijo, dijo Oliver como si leyera mis pensamientos. Simplemente te aconsejo que estés atento y me contactes si necesitas algo. Anotó su nuevo número de contacto, y hablamos un rato más sobre tiempos pasados, luego cada uno por su lado, él a un compromiso de negocios, yo a casa, sintiéndome algo más segura tras nuestra conversación. A mi regreso, la biblioteca sí había sido renovada. Las nuevas estanterías de cristal me parecieron extrañas y frías en mi casa victoriana. Los libros estaban ordenados, pero no en el orden que yo prefería. Los textos académicos se mezclaban con la ficción, y algunos volúmenes habían desaparecido por completo. ¿Dónde están los libros que quedan? Pregunté a Regina, que estaba terminando de colocar adornos decorativos en las estanterías. Ah, ya has vuelto, sonrió. Guardamos algunos libros viejos. Estaban en muy mal estado. Pero no te preocupes, no los tiramos. Simplemente los pusimos en el ático. ¿El ático? Como la mayoría de mis pertenencias. No discutí, simplemente subí las escaleras hasta el tercer piso, donde se encontraba el ático. La entrada estaba asegurada. Regina, ¿dónde está la llave del ático? Pregunté en la biblioteca. Eché la tiene. Se encogió de hombros. Dijo que no era seguro subir. Hay demasiadas cajas. Podrías caerte. Si necesitas algo, solo avísanos y te lo traeremos. Guardé silencio de nuevo, pero por dentro, hervía de resentimiento. Me había negado la entrada a mis pertenencias dentro de mi propia residencia. Eché regresó por la noche, alegre y animado. Padre, ¿qué te pareció nuestra sorpresa? Preguntó, acomodándose en mi sillón favorito cerca de la chimenea. Creo que es mucho más luminoso y contemporáneo. Me gustaba como estaba, dije secamente. Y quiero la llave del ático. ¿Por qué? Su sonrisa se desvaneció levemente. Porque mis cosas están ahí y quiero acceder a ellas. De verdad que no es seguro ahí arriba, padre. Eché negó con la cabeza. Deberías decirme que necesitas y lo encontraré yo mismo. Necesito la llave. Intenté hablar con firmeza. Esta es mi casa y tengo derecho a entrar donde quiera. De acuerdo. De acuerdo. Eché levantó las manos en un gesto apaciguador. Te daré la llave mañana. Solo prométeme que tengas cuidado. Regina nos llamó para cenar y la conversación cesó. En la mesa, Eché habló de su exitosa transacción comercial. Luego mencionó, por cierto, padre, recuerda lo que te dije sobre el poder notarial. Conozco a un notario que puede venir directamente. Ni siquiera tendrás que viajar. Todavía no estoy preparado para hablar de eso, dije, recordando la advertencia de Oliver. Pero es por tu bien, intervino Regina. ¿Y si te pasara algo? ¿Quién se haría cargo de los gastos, de la propiedad? Tengo salud suficiente para ocuparme de mis asuntos, dejé el utensilio. Gracias por la comida. Creo que me retiraré a mi habitación. En mi habitación, saqué los documentos de la propiedad de la mesita de noche y verifiqué que todo estuviera en orden. El título de propiedad, la escritura, el contrato de compraventa, el registro de impuestos, todo estaba correcto. Pero los comentarios de Oliver me rondaban la cabeza. Ten cuidado, me había dicho, y tenía la intención de seguir su consejo. Al día siguiente, Elliot no me dio la llave del ático, alegando que no la encontraba. Esa noche, durante la cena, de repente empezó a hablar de los problemas económicos de la familia de Regina. Sabes, su padre ha estado involucrado en otro plan sospechoso, dijo, ignorando la mirada de desaprobación de su esposa. Ahora se arriesgan a perder su último activo, la casa en las afueras. Te advertí que esa aventura era una apuesta arriesgada. No hables así de papá, dijo Regina en voz baja. Es un ingenuo. Ingenuo, resopló Elliot. Es un irresponsable, y ahora sus problemas se están convirtiendo en los nuestros. ¿Qué quieres decir? Pregunté, presentiendo problemas. Están buscando ayuda económica, claro. Elliot me miró como si fuera obvio. La familia es la familia. No podemos abandonarlos. ¿Cuánto piden? Intenté hablar con calma. Bastante, respondió Elliot con evasivas. Pero no te preocupes, nos las arreglaremos. Quise preguntar de dónde conseguirían los fondos, pero me contuve. Algo me decía que no apreciaría la respuesta. Una semana después, el ambiente en la casa se volvió aún más tenso. Observé a mi hijo y a su esposa susurrando constantemente sobre algo, y se callaban cuando yo aparecía. Mis pertenencias seguían desapareciendo de las zonas comunes. Al principio, eran objetos pequeños, un pequeño cofre que Vivian y yo habíamos adquirido en Londres. Luego, un reloj antiguo de la sala común. Después, unos candelabros de plata. Todo, declaró Regina, iría al ático, un lugar que se había vuelto inaccesible para mí. Simplemente estamos ordenando, explicó. Demasiadas cosas viejas lo hacen sentir abarrotado. Noté también otros cambios. Las facturas de luz y agua llegaban al correo electrónico de Elliot. Es más cómodo para pagar, padre. El cartero le entregó toda la correspondencia a Regina, quien la clasificó, y solo me llegó una pequeña parte. Incluso el paisajista ahora coordinaba todas las tareas con Elliot, no conmigo. Pero la señal más alarmante fue una conversación que escuché una noche. Entré en la cocina a buscar un vaso de líquido y oí voces que provenían del estudio, la habitación que antes era mía y ahora el espacio de trabajo de Elliot. No podemos prolongar esto más, decía Regina. Mis padres están a punto de perder su casa. Necesitamos los fondos de inmediato. Lo sé, la voz de Elliot sonaba irritada. Pero mi padre se obstina en lo del poder notarial. Sin él, no podemos embargar la propiedad. ¿Hipotecarla? ¿Mi casa? Me quedé paralizada, temerosa de moverme, por temor a revelar mi presencia. ¿Y si simplemente vendiéramos algunas de sus cosas? Sugirió Regina. Tiene un montón de objetos antiguos acumulando polvo en el ático. Sería ilegal sin su firma, respondió Elliot. Necesitamos esa maldita autorización legal. Entonces debemos ser más firmes, la voz de Regina era firme. Quizás deberíamos consultar con el médico si confirma que tu padre no puede tomar sus propias decisiones. Esa es la última opción, la interrumpió Elliot. Intentaré convencerlo de nuevo primero. Me retiré en silencio a mi habitación, olvidándome del agua. Me temblaban las manos. Tenía el pulso acelerado. Lo que había oído me asombró. No solo querían el control de mi residencia. Pretendían sobrecargarla para rescatar a los padres de Regina de la ruina financiera. Por la mañana, contacté con Oliver. Necesito verte, dije, asegurándome de que Elliot se había ido a trabajar y que Regina estaba ocupada en su habitación. Es urgente. Quedamos en encontrarnos en una pequeña cafetería cerca de la costa, lo suficientemente lejos de mi casa como para no encontrarme con Elliot ni con Regina por casualidad. Oliver escuchó mi relato sin interrumpirme. Su expresión se tornó cada vez más seria. Henry, dijo cuando terminé. La situación es más crítica de lo que pensé al principio. Podrían intentar declararte legalmente incompetente para tomar el control de la propiedad. Pero soy perfectamente capaz, objeté. El derrame cerebral leve fue leve y los médicos han confirmado mi completa recuperación. No siempre importa, Oliver negó con la cabeza. Si de todas formas pueden encontrar un médico que pueda realizar la evaluación deseada, debes actuar con rapidez. ¿Qué propones? Primero, nada de poderes notariales ni firmas en ningún documento que te presenten. Segundo, te aconsejo que dupliques todos los documentos importantes y los guardes, no aquí, sino, por ejemplo, en mi domicilio. Asentí. Y Henry, Oliver se acercó. Prepárate para que la situación se agrave si están realmente desesperados por las obligaciones de Regina. Podrían recurrir a medidas drásticas. ¿Cómo qué? Quizás intenten manipularte, inducirte a sentir culpa, aislarte de los demás. Podrían hacerte sentir que deseas irte. O, hizo una pausa, quizás intenten empeorar tu salud para poder controlarlo. Sus palabras me inquietaron. ¿Era mi hijo realmente capaz de semejante acto? El mismo niño que Vivian y yo habíamos criado con cariño y esmero. No lo creo, Elliot. Dudé. Espero que yo también esté imaginando planes. Oliver sonrió con tristeza. Pero es mejor estar seguro. Guarda tus registros en un lugar seguro. Asegúrate de tu buena salud y no firmes nada sin mi consulta. Miré a mi viejo amigo y comprendí que tenía razón. Algo había cambiado en mi hijo. Algo se había roto en nuestro vínculo. Y quizás era culpa mía. Demasiado absorto en el trabajo, demasiado absorto en mis propios asuntos como para ofrecerle a mi hijo el cariño que merecía. Pero ya era demasiado tarde para darle vueltas a eso. En ese preciso momento, necesitaba protegerme a mí mismo y a mi hogar, el último recuerdo de Vivian. Gracias, Oliver. Le estreché la mano a mi amigo. Seré cauteloso. Mientras conducía de vuelta a casa, sentí que una determinación crecía en mi interior. No permitiría que confiscaran mi propiedad, ni siquiera si eso significaba oponerse a mi propio hijo. Tenía que hacerlo por mi propio bien y por la memoria de Vivian. Pasaron 2 semanas desde aquella reunión con Oliver. 2 semanas llenas de pequeñas disputas, malentendidos y una tensión creciente. Guardé las escrituras de la casa en un contenedor seguro debajo del colchón. No era el lugar más ingenioso, pero no tenía otro. A diario comprobaba su presencia, y cada día los encontraba tranquilos. Al menos no habían entrado en mi habitación. Ese domingo por la mañana, me desperté con un alboroto inusual. Era evidente que había más gente en la casa de lo habitual. Voces, pasos, el sonido de muebles moviéndose, todo provenía del recibidor. Me vestí sin prisa, preparándome para otra sorpresa de Elliot y Regina. En las últimas semanas, sus sorpresas habían dejado de sorprenderme. Cortinas nuevas, la sustitución de mis viejos pero cómodos muebles por otros modernos y relucientes, la reconfiguración de la sala principal donde mi preciado sillón había sido relegado a un rincón y reemplazado por un sofá incómodo. Todo esto ocurría sin mi consentimiento y solía presentarse como una preocupación por mi comodidad y salud. Al salir de la habitación, me detuve, incrédulo. Había al menos 10 maletas y bolsas de viaje en el recibidor, y personas desconocidas se movían a su alrededor. Bueno, no del todo desconocidos, reconocí a los padres de Regina, a quienes había visto en su boda. Junto a ellos estaban un joven muy parecido a Regina, aparentemente su hermano, y una mujer de unos 25 años, presumiblemente su hermana. Padre, ahí están. Elliot parecía animado. Permítanme presentarles a los parientes de Regina. ¿Recuerdan a Alfred y Seila? Preguntó. Por supuesto, señaló a la pareja mayor. Y ellos son Lawrence, el hermano de Regina, y Pearl, su hermana. Asentí, intentando disimular mi asombro. Me alegra volver a verlos, les dije a los padres de Regina y les estreché la mano a sus hermanos. De repente, ¿qué los trae por aquí? Oh, es una historia larga. Alfred Buster, el padre de Regina, parecía nervioso. Un hombre corpulento con canas en retirada y expresión amable. Parecía más perplejo que seguro. Verán, han tenido algunos problemas de vivienda, lo interrumpió Elliot. Temporalmente, claro. Necesitaban un lugar donde vivir, y les sugerí que se quedaran con nosotros. Con nosotros. No pude ocultar la ironía. Tienen mucho espacio disponible. Elliot sonrió ampliamente, como si no hubiera percibido mi tono. Las familias están hechas para ayudarse mutuamente en tiempos difíciles, ¿verdad? No respondí, considerando la situación. Que Elliot no me hubiera pedido permiso antes de invitar a 4 personas a mi casa no me sorprendía, pero su seguridad de que no me opondría era impactante. ¿Cuánto tiempo piensa quedarse? Le pregunté directamente a Alfred. Bueno, dudó de nuevo, mirando a Elliot. El tiempo que sea necesario, padre. Elliot me puso la mano en el hombro, apretándome ligeramente, un gesto que podría haberse confundido con devoción filial. Pero detecté la advertencia, hasta que se resuelvan sus problemas bancarios. Les informé que podían vivir aquí sin coste alguno, el tiempo que fuera necesario. Gratis. Repetí, sintiendo cómo me invadía la indignación. Es muy generoso de tu parte, Elliot, sobre todo porque es de mi propiedad. Un silencio incómodo se apoderó del pasillo. Los padres de Regina intercambiaron miradas preocupadas. Lawrence fingió un gran interés en el estampado del tapiz, y Pearl se quedó absorta en su teléfono. ¿Podríamos hablar en privado? Elliot seguía sonriendo, pero su mirada se había oscurecido. Por supuesto. Me dirigí al estudio y me volví hacia la familia Baster. Si nos disculpan un momento. Al cerrarse la puerta del estudio tras nosotros, Elliot me miró bruscamente. ¿Cuál es tu problema, padre? ¿No comprendes su situación? Mi problema es que estás invitando a desconocidos a vivir en mi casa sin consultarme. Intenté hablar con calma, aunque por dentro me hervía la sangre. Además, les prometes alojamiento gratuito como si fueras el dueño. Pensé que te gustaría ayudar a los familiares. Elliot cruzó los brazos. Al fin y al cabo, ahora también son tu familia. Son parientes de Regina, no míos, y ni siquiera entiendo cuál es su problema. Elliot suspiró como si se dirigiera a un joven confundido. Te lo dije. Alfred invirtió en una empresa fallida, y ahora el banco está embargando su vivienda. Simplemente no tienen dónde vivir. Y esa es mi preocupación. ¿Por qué? Porque eres mi padre, Elliot alzó la voz. ¿Y porque hay mucho espacio en esta casa, sugieres que los echemos a la calle? Negué con la cabeza. No, pero te sugiero que la próxima vez me pidas mi opinión antes de invitar a gente a vivir en mi casa. De acuerdo. Elliot asintió rápidamente. Admito que debería haberlo hablado contigo al principio, pero ya están aquí. No puedo ordenarles que se vayan. ¿Dónde dormirán? Pregunté, dándome cuenta de que discutir era inútil. Solo hay 3 habitaciones en la casa, y todas están ocupadas. Ya lo hemos considerado todo. Elliot sonrió, complacido por mi rendición. Lawrence y Alfred dormirán en la habitación principal, en el sofá y una cama provisional. Seila y Pearl ocuparán la antigua habitación de los niños en el segundo piso. ¿Te refieres a mi antiguo espacio de trabajo? Estaba vacío de todas formas. Elliot se encogió de hombros. Mira, sé que es un inconveniente, pero es provisional, y ellos ayudarán en la casa, cocinando, limpiando. Ni siquiera notará su presencia. Lo dudaba, pero opté por no discutir, al menos por ahora. Necesitaba reflexionar sobre la situación y quizás consultar con Oliver. La casa había estado bulliciosa todo el día. La familia Baster se estaba instalando, desempacando y ocupando cada vez más espacio. Al anochecer, la habitación principal, destinada a Alfred y Lawrence, estaba llena de sus pertenencias. La antigua habitación infantil, donde se alojaban Seila y Pearl, también se transformó, con cuadros en las paredes, sus alfombras y frascos de perfumes y lociones por todas partes. Observé la intrusión, sintiéndome cada vez más como una extraña en mi propia morada. Era como si no fuera la propietaria, sino una invitada a la que se le permitía quedarse por cortesía. Intenté mantener las distancias con los nuevos residentes todo el día, pero a la hora de cenar, tuve que unirme a la reunión. Regina se había esforzado muchísimo. La mesa estaba repleta de platos que nunca antes había visto en mi casa, verduras exóticas, carnes asadas, dulces elaborados. Siéntate, Henry. Seila señaló una silla al fondo de la mesa, no mi lugar habitual en la cabecera, que ahora ocupaba Elliot. ¿Qué te parece nuestra comida? Regina y yo hemos estado trabajando todo el día. Huele delicioso, respondí cortésmente, aunque me dolió la facilidad con la que me habían relegado a un segundo plano en mi propia casa. La comida comenzó con copas de vino espumoso mientras Elliot proponía un brindis por la unidad familiar y el apoyo mutuo en tiempos difíciles. Todos compartieron su entusiasmo menos yo.
I merely sipped my drink, feeling little inclination to celebrate. During the repast, the conversation inevitably shifted to the Baxter family's woes. "We've lost everything," Sheila declared dramatically, dabbing her eyes with a serviette.
7 years of life, al fornaught because of one missed.
"It wasn't a misstep, dear," Alfred argued. "It was a promising endeavor. It was simply that the associate was dishonest." "A dishonest person I asked you to vet from the outset," Sheila countered. "But of course, you always know best." "Don't start that again," Lawrence intervened, leaning back in his chair. He was tall, with a thin face and unkempt hair, conveying the impression of a man accustomed to an effortless existence. "What's done is done.
Now we must devise a way out."
"Precisely," Pearl said, still engrossed with her phone. Unlike her brother, she was petite, with vibrant cosmetics and many wrist adornments. "Perhaps Uncle Harvey can assist." "Harvey hasn't spoken to us since I didn't back him in the local council elections," Alfred sighed. "And he's not experiencing the best of times himself." "It will all be fine," Elliot raised his glass. "We'll help you regain stability, won't we, Father?" All gazes turned to me. I realized I was expected to concur and perhaps offer financial aid. "I'm sure Elliot will do what he can," I stated evasively. "Of course, I will." Elliot smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "By the way, while we're discussing finances, Father, there's something I wish to talk about with you."
He tensed, sensing impending trouble.
"What is it?" "You see, with the new occupants, the upkeep cost of the house will rise considerably. Electricity, water, heating. I thought it would be equitable for you to contribute your portion." "My portion?" I couldn't believe my ears. "For residing in your own home?" "Not the rent, the utilities," Elliot corrected me. "You're the one enjoying all the comforts, and Regina and I will be settling the accounts." "Which I'd always paid myself," I reminded him. "From my pension?" "Yes, but things have changed," Regina interjected. "There are more of us now, and the expenditures have increased. Plus, Elliot and I have assumed all the household duties, cleaning, cooking, gardening. That incurs costs, too." "How much do you wish me to pay?" My voice sounded calm, though my insides churned with outrage. "We've calculated." Elliot extracted a folded paper from his pocket. "Considering your room, your share of common areas, electricity, water, and other expenses, approximately £600 per month would be reasonable." I looked at my son in silence. £600 was nearly half my pension for a room in the house I constructed, and for which I was still paying property levies. "You've always valued fairness, Father," Elliot added, observing my reaction. "And it truly is fair. Everyone contributes their part." "And Regina's family?" I gestured towards the Baxters. "Are they going to contribute as well?" "I told you they're living without charge." Elliot's voice grew annoyed. "They're experiencing hardship, and I'm the one with the easy solution."
I put my fork down, my appetite gone.
"I am a retiree, Elliot. My pension isn't substantial." "You have savings," Regina intervened. "Elliot mentioned you and Vivian had a respectable bank balance." I looked at my son. "Are you discussing my personal finances with her?" "She's my wife," Elliot replied defiantly. "We keep no secrets from each other." "And how long have you been planning this payment?"
I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat.
"No one planned anything." Elliot spread his hands. "It was simply a situation. Regina's relatives require assistance, and we cannot decline. And to cover the costs, we need your help. So, I must support not only you and your wife, but her entire family?" No one is supporting anyone, Lawrence interjected for the first time, displaying interest in the discussion. We simply help each other. When I become stable, and I shall be soon, and my new business strategy is almost complete, I'll repay you many times over. Of course you will, I murmured to myself, but no one seemed to notice. So, we have an arrangement. Elliot handed me a sheet of paper. £600 monthly, beginning tomorrow. I took the paper and read it carefully. It wasn't just an estimate. It was a formal rental agreement written in legal terminology. It specified the sum, the due date, and even penalties for delayed payment. My name was listed as the occupant, and Elliot's name as the proprietor. You drafted a lease for my own home? I couldn't fathom what was occurring.
Just to be prudent, Elliot shrugged.
To make it official. Official. I repeated. And on what grounds do you regard yourself as the landlord? Well, I manage the property now, Elliot frowned. Paying bills, affecting repairs, making choices. I still own the dwelling. I folded the paper and placed it beside my dish. And I am not signing that contract. A heavy silence filled the table.
Seila and Alfred exchanged uneasy glances.
Pearl stopped typing on her device, and Lawrence grinned openly, as if observing an entertaining performance. Father, Elliot's voice had softened, but it held a firm edge. I understand you're displeased, but let's face facts, you're no longer capable of maintaining this house alone after your health scare. Minor stroke, I corrected, which occurred almost 3 months ago. I've made a complete recovery. Still, you're not quite the same, Elliot continued. You need daily assistance, and we're prepared to provide it for a reasonable charge. I don't require assistance, I rose from the table. And I'm not paying to reside in my own house. Then perhaps you should consider a specialized care facility. Regina's words struck like stones. You'll be tended to by professionals there. I looked at her, the cold, calculating woman my son had inexplicably chosen to marry. This is my house, I stated firmly.
I built it for my loved ones.
I paid for every brick, every timber, and I'm not leaving simply because you lack sufficient funds to support Regina's relatives. Don't speak of my parents in that manner, Regina stood up, her face distorted with rage. They are respectable people who merely had bad fortune. Bad fortune multiple times over, from what you tell me. I remained calm. And now you wish to rectify their difficulties at my expense. At our expense, Elliot corrected. Family is supposed to stick together. Family, Elliot, involves responsibilities as much as privileges. I looked him directly in the eye. And respect is paramount. With those words, I departed the table, leaving my meal unfinished and my relatives bewildered. In their gazes, I saw various emotions. Regina's fury, Elliot's cold calculation, Alfred and Sheila's embarrassment, Lawrence's curiosity, and Pearl's disinterest. Not a single look contained sympathy or understanding. In my small room, I sat on my bed and gazed for a long time out the window at the darkening garden, the garden Vivian cherished so deeply. What would she say if she saw what our home had become, what our son had become? I extracted a container of papers from beneath the mattress. Everything was there, the title document, the deed, the purchase agreement, the tax receipts. The house was mine, and no rental contract Elliot had drafted could alter that. I didn't know what I would do next, but one thing I knew for certain was that this situation could not persist. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it quickly. It was a wakeful night. I lay in my unusually small bed and listened to the house grow quiet. First, the voices in the living room where Alfred and Lawrence were settled, and then the lights in Sheila and Pearl's room extinguished. Elliot and Regina were the last to quiet down. I could hear their muffled conversation from the main bedroom that had once belonged to Vivian and me. Vivian, how I wished she were here now. She always knew how to navigate the most challenging situations calmly, with grace, without losing her composure. Unlike me, I was always too direct, too severe in my assessments.
You're like a bulldozer, Henry, she'd say, shaking her head.
Sometimes you need a more subtle approach. I closed my eyes and allowed the memories to return. Vivian, young and radiant, with her red hair gathered into a casual bun, wearing a simple dress stained with paint. We had just acquired this property and commenced renovations. It was 1976. We'd been wed for 5 years, and we'd finally amassed enough for a down payment. The house was in dreadful condition, a dilapidated Victorian estate that no one desired to purchase due to the extensive work required. But Vivian fell in love with it instantly. Look at those ornate cornices, Henry, and the fireplace in the stairwell. It's a genuine gem. All I could perceive was a leaking roof, decaying floors, and a broken heating system. But I couldn't resist her fervency. We bought the house and dedicated the next 3 years to its restoration. Every evening after work, every weekend, I, a chemical engineer in a research laboratory, while Vivian worked in publishing. Funds were limited, but we were youthful and energetic. When Elliot arrived, the house was nearly complete. I personally painted the nursery blue, and Vivian sewed the window treatments and bedspread. We were so content, a small family in our own hard-won abode. Where did we err in our son's upbringing? When did he transform into the cold, calculating man who was now attempting to expel me from my own dwelling? Could it be that I was working too much? Or was it that Vivian and I had been too permissive, allowing him to have whatever he wished, or conversely, too demanding, expecting only excellent grades and achievements? I sighed and turned onto my other side. Dwelling on the past wouldn't resolve the present dilemma. And the problem was serious. My own child and his spouse were trying to seize my property to alleviate her family's financial woes. Their strategy was clear: compel me to either sign a proxy to manage the estate or enter a nursing home, granting them full authority over the house. Either scenario would give them command of the property, which commanded a significant sum. A Victorian mansion in a desirable Plymouth area could yield several $100,000. I opened my eyes once more.
Demonstró un through the window, castin estranges a 12 pan de wall. A sound captured my awareness.
Footsteps in the passageway. Quiet, cautious.
I tensed, listening.
Someone paused at my door.
I held my breath.
The doorknob slowly turned. Thankfully, I'd secured it, as I had every night since Elliot and Regina had moved in. A pause followed, then the footsteps receded. My heart pounded in my chest. Who was that? What were they searching for? Could it be the property deeds? I reached beneath the mattress and fumbled for the container. It was still there, but this incident had convinced me I couldn't postpone action. I had to contact Oliver in the morning and proceed. But how? What could I do to thwart their scheme? I sat up in bed and switched on the bedside lamp. Sleep was impossible anyway. Pulling out the container, I opened it and examined the contents. The ownership certificate in my name, the sales contract, tax receipts from recent years. Everything was in order, but most of the papers were discolored with age. The house had been purchased almost 50 years ago. As I reviewed the documents, I recalled that a copy of my last will must exist somewhere. Vivian and I had prepared them simultaneously about 10 years prior, when she exhibited the initial signs of her illness. According to the will, all our assets, including the house, were to pass to Elliot upon the death of the last of us. I searched through all the papers, but I couldn't locate the will. It had to be somewhere within the house. Perhaps in the strongbox located in my former office, now Elliot's room. Accessing that strongbox was currently impossible. The will could be modified, however. Given the circumstances, that would be prudent. If Elliot was so eager to acquire the property that he was willing to expel his own father, then perhaps he didn't merit an inheritance. But to amend the will, I would require a legal professional. Fortunately, I had Oliver, a trusted friend and seasoned practitioner, and I intended to visit him at the earliest chance. I spent the remainder of the night contemplating a course of action. By morning, A plan had solidified in my mind. Not flawless, but the best I could devise under the present conditions. Rising before everyone else, I dressed swiftly and slipped out of the house. The crisp morning air of Plymouth invigorated my thoughts. I headed for the nearest coffee shop where I could converse quietly on the phone. The clock displayed 7:30. A bit early for a call, but the situation was critical. To my relief, Oliver answered after the third ring.
Henry, vas a mis.
His voice sounded concerned. The early call must have alerted him. Oliver, I need your assistance, I stated softly, though no one was in the cafe save for the sleepy server. The situation is complex. I briefly recounted yesterday's happenings, the arrival of Regina's parents, brother and sister, the demand for rent, the nocturnal visitor at my door.
Damn it, Henry. This is serious.
Oliver didn't conceal his alarm. They're practically attempting to remove you from your own residence. Exactly. I took a sip of the coffee the server had just delivered. That's why I need your help. Legal intervention. Certainly, Oliver answered without hesitation. What do you wish to do? First, amend the will, I declared firmly. I do not want Elliot to inherit the property when I pass away. Second, I need to safeguard my rights to the house now, while I am alive. They might try to declare me incompetent. I understand. Oliver paused, evidently considering the matter.
Could you come to my office today? Say 10 o'clock.
Yes. I was relieved. Thank you, Oliver.
Don't thank me.
That's what companions are for. He paused. And Henry, be vigilant. From what you've related, they could go to extreme lengths. I returned home around 8:30. The house was already active. Voices emanated from the kitchen, along with the scent of sizzling meat. I slipped quietly into my room, trying to avoid encountering anyone. I needed to compose myself before facing them. Spreading the documents from the container on the bed, I selected those I might require today. The certificate of title, the sales contract, the bank records confirming I was the one settling the mortgage. I folded them all neatly into the leather portfolio I'd used during my lab career. There was a rap at the door. I quickly tucked the remaining papers beneath the mattress and opened it. Alfred Baxter, Regina's father, stood on the threshold, a portly man with thinning gray hair and a look of guilt on his face. "Good morning, Henry," he said, shifting his weight. "May I enter?" I nodded, and he squeezed into the room, surveying the surroundings as if evaluating them. "It's cozy," he offered, though his voice was clearly disingenuous. The room was small and cramped, with minimal furnishings. "To what do I owe this call?" I asked bluntly, not wishing to waste time on pleasantries. Alfred grew even more embarrassed. "I wanted to discuss yesterday's incident."
"The dinner querens."
"Awkward is when you spill tea on the tablecloth, Alfred," I retorted dryly. "And yesterday was an attempted financial coercion."
No, Alfred waved his hands.
"No one is coercing anything. Elliot merely wished to maintain fairness. It costs money to upkeep a large residence. And I own the property," I interrupted him, "and I've always covered my own expenses. If Elliot and Regina cannot afford to sustain your family, that is not my concern." Alfred reddened. "Look, we're not parasites. We're just facing temporary difficulties. Lawrence is about to launch a new enterprise. Pearl is seeking employment. And you?" I inquired. "What do you and your wife plan to do?" "Well, he hesitated. "I'm going to take a break and search for fresh investment prospects. I have many contacts, you know." "Contacts that didn't help you retain your home," I observed. Alfred clenched his hands.
"You don't grasp."
That project was sound. It was simply that the collaborator was unscrupulous. It could have happened to anyone. "But somehow it only happens to you," I sighed. "Look, Alfred, I have nothing against you personally, but what's happening now is improper. You and your family intruded into my home uninvited, and now you expect me to fund your stay. We didn't intrude. Elliot invited us, Alfred objected. Elliot has no right to do that, I replied.
The house belongs to me.
Alfred was silent for a moment, contemplating my words. What are you going to do? He asked at last. Protect my entitlements, I answered simply. You wouldn't expel your own son, would you? There was a note of apprehension in his voice. I haven't finalized my decision, I stated, though I knew precisely what I would do. But I'm not going to permit myself to become a renter in my own house. Alfred nodded, hesitated for a moment, then, without a word, departed the room.
Y glanced at my timepiece. 9:15.
It was time to head to Oliver's. Taking the document holder, I left the room and proceeded towards the main entrance. Lawrence and Pearl were seated in the living room. He was perusing the newspaper. She was typing something on her portable computer. Both looked up as I passed.
Going somewhere, Mr. Torndikeke?
Lawrence asked with a languid smile. Business, I answered concisely. What kind of business could a retired gentleman conduct? Pearl tittered, but I disregarded her question and continued towards the door. Regina intercepted me in the corridor.
Henry, are you leaving?
I was just about to serve the morning meal. I'm not hungry, I falsely claimed, though my stomach was cramping. I hadn't eaten since the previous night's dinner. But you need to maintain your strength, she insisted with feigned concern, especially at your age.
Thank you for your solicitude, Regina.
But I'm perfectly capable of deciding when I eat. I stepped around her and grasped the doorknob. When will you return? She persisted. Elliot and I wish to speak with you about something. I don't know, I replied honestly. Perhaps by midday. She was clearly about to ask something further, but I had already opened the door and stepped outside. The liberation, albeit brief, felt incredibly good. Oliver's office was downtown in an aged structure overlooking the harbor. I'd reached it by public transport, savoring the simple chance to be away from home and all its new occupants.
Oliver met me in the reception area.
Henry, delighted you made it. Come right in. We don't have much time. I looked at him in surprise. Why? Because I have a meeting with the legal scribe at 11:30, he explained, guiding me into his workspace. If we intend to modify the will today, we must act swiftly. You were always efficient, I smiled for the first time in a considerable period. In Oliver's office, we delved into legal matters. I presented him with all the papers I'd brought and elucidated the situation thoroughly. So, Oliver removed his spectacles and massaged the bridge of his nose. Legally, the property is entirely yours. Elliot holds no rights to it except what he would have received in your testament upon your passing. He cannot demand rent or expel you. Furthermore, it is you who can remove him and everyone else if you so desire. That's precisely what I plan to do, I stated firmly. But first, we must alter the will.
Are you certain?
Oliver looked at me carefully.
This is your son, Henry, your sole offspring.
The son who's attempting to force me from my home, I reminded him, who brought strangers into my house without my permission and now demands I pay to reside there, who may have tried to intrude into my room at night to locate the property documents. Yes, Oliver. I am certain of it. Oliver nodded. Good. In that case, let's discuss how you wish to distribute your assets. We spent the next hour composing a new will. According to its terms, the house would go not to Elliot, but to a charitable organization supporting children battling cancer, a foundation Vivian had aided during the final years of her life. Elliot would receive only a small fraction of my savings, just enough not to dispute the will, but nothing more. At precisely 11:30, the legal scribe arrived, an older woman with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. Mr. Thorndikeek, I am Eleanor Price, the notary introduced herself. Mr. Holt has explained the circumstances to me, she said in a professional, objective manner. Before we proceed, I need to confirm you are acting voluntarily and are fully cognizant of the repercussions of your decisions. I am absolutely confident in my choice, Mrs. Price, I responded. And I am fully competent, as my treating physician can verify, if needed. Good, she nodded. In that case, let us commence. We spent the next hour completing all the necessary legal forms. In addition to the new will, Oliver proposed that I sign a power of attorney in his name, not to manage the estate, but to represent me in court should Elliot attempt to challenge my actions. It's merely a safeguard, he clarified. If they try to limit your autonomy or access to legal assistance, I'll possess the authority to act on your behalf. I agreed.
It sounded sensible.
When all the papers were signed and witnessed, Mrs. Price made duplicate copies for her records and for me. Copies of your revised will shall be kept by me and Mr. Holt, she stated. I suggest you store the original in a secure spot. Not at home, but in a safety deposit box, for example. I can offer my secure vault, Oliver interjected. It's more protected than a bank box. I consented to that as well. The fewer documents left at home, the better. What now? I asked when Mrs. Price had departed and Oliver and I were alone. Now, Oliver leaned back in his seat. You must decide what you intend to do about the unwelcome guests in your residence. I want them gone, I declared firmly. All of them. Regina's family and Elliot and his wife. That's your prerogative, Oliver nodded. But we must proceed lawfully, so they cannot make subsequent claims. What I propose is that I draft a formal removal notice that you present to Elliot. It will stipulate a deadline, typically 2 weeks, within which they must vacate the premises. And if they decline? I inquired. Then we'll go to court.
Oliver was serious.
But since you officially own the property and they possess no rights to it, the court will side with you. I nodded, experiencing both resolve and sorrow simultaneously. I never imagined I'd have to evict my own son from the home I'd built for our loved ones. But there was no alternative. Elliot had made that choice himself when he opted to transform me into a tenant in my own dwelling. Okay, I said. Prepare the notice. In the interim, I'm thinking I don't believe I'll return home immediately.
Contemplad things.
I need to compose myself before encountering them again. That's logical, Oliver agreed. The notice will be prepared by this evening. Come by around 5, and I'll give you the paperwork. I stood up, feeling strangely relieved. The strategy was ready. Tomorrow, I would present Elliot with the eviction notice and begin to reclaim command of my home. It would likely be painful for all of us, but it was essential. Thank you, Oliver.
I shook my friend's hand. For everything.
You're welcome, he smiled. That's what companions are for. And Henry, he paused. Be careful. They might not relinquish so easily. I will, I promised, and exited the office, feeling for the first time in a long while like I was initiating action, not merely reacting to others' deeds. I returned to the house in the late afternoon, around 8, when it was already dark outside. All day I had roamed around Plymouth, visiting old familiar spots, enjoying lunch at the small cafe by the waterfront where Vivian and I used to enjoy going. Every now and then I checked my phone. Elliot had called 3 times, but I didn't answer. By 5 o'clock, I'd gone to Oliver's home to collect the documents he'd prepared, the official removal order, a duplicate of my new will, and a few other legal papers I didn't entirely grasp, but Oliver assured me I might need them. The main entrance opened as soon as I inserted the key. Apparently, someone had been awaiting my return. Elliot stood on the doorstep, his expression a mix of irritation and apprehension.
Dad, where have you been?
We were worried. His voice sounded tense, and his gaze shifted to the leather folder in my hand. Out for a walk, I answered calmly, walking past him into the house. I didn't realize I had to report my movements. The entire family was in the main room. Regina was seated in a chair with a book. Alfred and Sheila were conversing softly on the sofa. Lawrence was perusing a periodical. And Pearl was on her phone as usual. When I appeared, everyone ceased talking and looked at me.
Henry. Regina put the book down.
We were considering calling the authorities. You've never been gone this long without informing us.
I'm a grown man, Regina.
I walked to a chair and sat down. And this is my home. I can come and go as I wish. Of course. She pursed her lips. It's just that, after your minor stroke, we're concerned about your well-being. That's very touching. I didn't hide my sarcasm, especially considering yesterday's discussion about the rental agreement. Elliot threw a warning glance at his wife, and sat down opposite me. I understand you're upset. Perhaps £600 is too much. We can discuss a different sum. No need.
I shook my head.
I'm not going to pay to live in my own house. Not 600, not 6. But that's fair, Regina began. We are, aren't we?
I tell you something, he interrupted, looking around.
I'm departing for a couple of days. I'm going to visit an old friend in Exeter.
You're leaving?
Elliot frowned. Now. Tomorrow morning, I nodded. I'll be back in 2 or 3 days. But father, you can't travel alone, Elliot protested. After I'm perfectly fine, I stated. And the decision has already been made.
I'm simply informing you so you don't panic as you did today.
Silence filled the room. I could see Elliot and Regina exchanging glances, Alfred and Sheila watching us wearily, Lawrence smirking as if enjoying the show. Who is this friend? Elliot finally asked. Do I know him? I don't think so, I answered, avoiding specifics. An old colleague. I wasn't truly going anywhere. It was a deception to lower their vigilance and gain time for the next phase of my plan. I needed them not to expect my return, not to prepare for it. Well, Elliot shrugged, attempting to conceal his obvious relief. If you're sure you can manage it.
When are you leaving?
After breakfast. I rose from my chair. Now, if you don't mind, I'm retiring to my room. It's been an exhausting day. Of course, father. Elliot smiled. Get some rest.
If you need anything, just let me know.
I nodded and headed for my room, feeling their scrutiny on my back.
I locked the door, a new routine.
I concealed the document folder in my clothing drawer beneath a pile of sweaters, not the most inventive spot, but there was no better place in the small room. The next morning passed calmly. I ate breakfast with everyone else, striving to act normally. Elliot and Regina were conspicuously polite, as if yesterday's disagreement hadn't occurred at all. Alfred and Sheila were discussing a television program. Lawrence was talking about his new business proposal, and Pearl was complaining about the scarcity of decent employment. After breakfast, I packed a small travel bag with a dental brush, a shaving tool, and a few changes of undergarments. Sheila even offered me some sandwiches for the journey, which I politely declined. Well, I paused at the front entrance with my bag in hand. See you in a few days. Have a safe trip, father.
Elliot shook my hand. Call me when you arrive. I will, I lead, and exited the house.
I did make it to the transit stop and even boarded the bus heading towards the train station, just in case one of them was observing me. But I disembarked at the next stop and headed for Oliver's residence, who lived in the adjacent neighborhood. We had agreed that I would spend the night at his place, and then return home the following day with assistance. I spent the evening in the company of Oliver and his wife Margaret, who served us a delicious meal and tactfully refrained from asking too many inquiries. We conversed about old times, about our youth, about Vivian. For the first time in a long while, I felt at ease and relaxed, without the constant pressure that accompanied me at home.
In the morning, Oliver woke me at 7.
Get up, Henry. We must be in court by 9. I dressed swiftly, and we departed in Oliver's vehicle. He explained that he had arranged an urgent hearing for me the day before, the kind sometimes held for property emergencies. Judge Hammond is a long-standing acquaintance of mine, Oliver explained. He's agreed to prioritize your case. We spent about 2 hours at the courthouse. I detailed my situation thoroughly, presented all the property deeds, informed him about the coercion from my son and his wife, the uninvited guests, and the demand for rent. Judge Hammond, a serious man with graying temples, listened carefully, examined the documents, and ruled that I had every right to demand the removal of anyone from my home, and if they refused to depart voluntarily, the sheriff could be summoned to remove them. Given the circumstances, the judge added, specifically the attempted psychological pressure on an elderly individual to gain command of his property, I am issuing an immediate eviction order. Normally, 2 weeks would be granted, but in this instance, I am making an exception. I was grateful for this ruling. Oliver suggested I immediately contact the sheriff to accompany me on my journey home. It's standard procedure for removals, he explained, especially in cases where there's a risk of confrontation. The sheriff's office was in an adjacent building. There we were met by a middle-aged woman with a short hairstyle and a sharp gaze, Sheriff Donovan. She reviewed the court directive and nodded.
I can escort you right away, Mr. Thorndike.
Or do you require time to prepare? The sooner the better, I replied. If possible, immediately. On the drive back to the house, I further informed Sheriff Donovan about the situation, how the pressure had commenced, how I'd been progressively forced out of my own home, how the rent had finally been demanded. I often deal with family disputes over real estate, she commented. But to demand rent from your own father for his own property, that's unprecedented. I sighed. For me, too. Just before arriving home, I recalled another case Oliver had mentioned the previous day. Checking my finances, he had uncovered unusual transactions in my retirement account. Small sums were regularly transferred to Elliot's account. Oliver requested bank statements, and they confirmed that Elliot had withdrawn approximately £3,000 from my account over the past 3 months without my awareness. How is that possible? I had asked then. He doesn't have access to my accounts. He probably possesses your online banking credentials, Oliver suggested. Or he forged your signature on some document. Either way, it's financial deception, and we can add that to the legal action. Now, I possessed not only the title deed and the eviction command, but also proof of Elliot's financial misconduct. We pulled up to the house around 2 in the afternoon. I was experiencing a peculiar blend of emotions, determination, bitterness, anger, but also a certain relief that matters would finally be resolved.
Sheriff Donovan rang the door chime.
Regina opened it, her face contorted in surprise at seeing me in the company of a uniformed woman. Henry, she looked from me to the sheriff.
What's happening?
You're supposed to be in Exeter. May I enter? Sheriff Donovan asked in an official tone.
I possess a court order.
Regina stepped back silently, allowing us into the house. Everyone else was in the main room, apparently just finishing their midday meal. At our entrance, they froze as if in a tableau. Dad.
Elliot rose from the sofa.
What's wrong? Why did you return? And who is this woman? Sheriff Donovan, she introduced herself, displaying her badge. I have a court order to remove the unauthorized occupants from Mr. Henry Thorndike's residence. What unauthorized occupants? Elliot grinned nervously. There must be some error. I'm his son.
Y reside here.
Without my consent, I interrupted him. And furthermore, you invited strangers to live in my home, and then demanded rent from me. Father, let's discuss this privately. Elliot glanced anxiously at the sheriff. I'm sure we can resolve this as a family.
It's too late, Elliot. I shook my head.
I offered you an opportunity. You did not seize it. I retrieved the court order from the folder and handed it to Elliot. According to this document, you all must vacate my house immediately. You may take your personal belongings, but all furniture and fixtures belonging to me remain in place. Elliot scanned the document, and his face turned pale. You cannot do that.
I am your son.
The son who tried to force me from my own home, I reminded him.
The son who demanded money from me to live here.
The son who, as it happens, withdrew funds from my retirement account without my knowledge. What? Regina turned sharply to Elliot. You took his money? Elliot looked cornered. I just borrowed some. I was going to repay it. £3,000 in 3 months is not a small sum. I pulled out another document, a bank statement. And judging by the regularity of the withdrawals, you had no intention of repaying it. I can explain. Elliot turned to the sheriff.
It's a miscommunication.
My father gave me oral permission to use his account to settle the house expenses. That's a falsehood.
I shook my head.
And I possess documentation that I paid all the house bills myself until you transferred them into your name without my authorization. Elliot's face contorted with fury. You're just an elderly, stubborn, self-centered man.
I cared for you when you were unwell.
I moved here to assist you. You moved here to seize my property, I replied calmly. And you used my illness as a pretext.
Sheriff Donovan intervened.
I suggest we all calm down. I possess a court order, and I have an obligation to enforce it. You can challenge it in court, but you must leave the house now. Alfred Baxter, who had been observing in silence until then, stood up.
We understand.
We will depart. Sheila, Pearl, Lawrence, pack your items. Where are we going? Sheila protested. We have no residence. That's not my concern, I stated firmly. You arrived here uninvited, living at my expense, and now you must leave. Regina turned to Elliot. You said it was acceptable, that your father approved, that you had legal authority to manage the property. I had power of attorney. Elliot looked confused. My father signed it when he was in the hospital, which I revoked. I showed him another document. 2 weeks ago, when I realized where this was headed. Elliot collapsed onto the couch, covering his face with his hands. You're destroying our family, father.
Do you comprehend that? No, Elliot, I shook my head.
You're the one who destroyed our family when you chose to make me a renter in my own home. When you brought strangers here without my consent. When you began pilfering my money. Regina rushed upstairs, shouting over her shoulder. I'm packing. I don't wish to remain in this house a minute longer. Her parents and brother and sister followed her. Elliot remained seated on the couch, staring at the floor. I'll give you 3 hours to pack, I said. Sheriff Donovan will remain here to supervise the process, and I want the keys to the attic now. Elliot silently pulled a cluster of keys from his pocket and detached one. Here, pleased. I took the key, but didn't respond. I was contending with conflicting emotions inside me, relief that I had regained command of my existence, and profound sorrow that it had come to this. My son, my flesh and blood, the man Vivian and I had nurtured with affection and care, had transformed into an unfamiliar person, an adversary. The subsequent 3 hours passed in tense silence. The Baxter family bustled with packing. Regina flitted between rooms with tear-stained eyes. Elliot silently packed garments and books. I sat in the main room next to Sheriff Donovan, observing the procedure. You'll need to change the locks, she said softly. So they can't return. I nodded.
Ella be here tonight.
Finally, everything was packed and carried outside. Sheriff Donovan ensured they didn't take anything that belonged to me. Elliot was the last one out of the house, pausing on the threshold. You're going to regret this, father. When you're isolated, without assistance, without backing.
You ella recall my words.
Better alone than with individuals who only perceive you as a source of funds and real estate, I stated. Elliot shook his head and exited, slamming the door. I was left standing in the passageway of my home, now truly my home.
Are you all right, Mr. Torniqueque?
Sheriff Donovan asked, observing me carefully. Yes, I answered after a pause. For the first time in a long while, I was truly okay. The week following the expulsion of Elliot, Regina, and her relatives had been arduous, but essential to restoring order to my home. As Sheriff Donovan had recommended, I contacted a locksmith that same evening to replace all the locks. I then performed an inventory of the property. To my relief, most of the valuables were still present. Although a few items, including silver candle holders and antique timepieces, had vanished, that was the least of my concerns. Now, the first thing I did the next day was to ascend to the attic to check what had become of my possessions that Elliot and Regina had supposedly neatly arranged there. The scene I witnessed was disheartening. Containers of books and records piled haphazardly, some opened, their contents scattered about. My winter clothing was in bags stacked in a corner. Some of my photo albums and papers were spread out on an old table. Evidently, someone had been examining them. I spent the day in the attic sorting and arranging things, deciding what to return to the rooms and what to leave there. The task was physically taxing for someone my age, but I took my time. Every item I discovered, every photograph, every book brought me back to myself, to my existence that had been nearly stolen from me. On the third day, I hired a professional cleaning service to thoroughly cleanse the house. 5 uniformed women labored for almost 12 hours, washing windows, cleaning floor coverings, polishing furnishings. When they were finished, the house resembled the one Vivian and I once inhabited again. Clean, welcoming, full of light. The next step was reclaiming my private sleeping area. I moved my personal effects from the small guest room to the master bedroom where Vivian and I had spent so many years. Elliot and Regina had left their furniture there, a large modern bed, glass bedside tables, some abstract artworks on the walls. I called the movers who transported it all to the garage and then brought in our old furniture from the attic. A dark oak bed, an antique chest of drawers, a carved looking-glass. By the conclusion of the week, the house was almost entirely restored. Of course, it no longer appeared precisely as it had in Vivian's era. Too much had been altered, discarded, reconfigured, but it was still my dwelling, and I was relieved to return to normalcy. Saturday morning, as I was consuming breakfast in the kitchen, the doorbell chimed. I wasn't anticipating guests, and my heart tightened uneasily. Had Elliot returned? When I peered through the peephole, I saw my son standing on the porch with a serious expression. I hesitated to open the door, but then decided that eventually this conversation had to occur. "Good morning, Father," Elliot said when I opened the door. He looked fatigued, with dark circles under his eyes. "May I come in? We need to speak." I stepped back silently, allowing him into the house. We walked into the kitchen where my half-finished cup of coffee and uneaten toast rested on the table. "Would you like some coffee?" I inquired, maintaining maximum politeness. "No thanks." Elliot sat down at the table, looking around the kitchen. "You changed the window treatments." "I reinstated the ones I had before," I corrected, sitting across from him. "They were stored in the attic." Elliot nodded, then took a deep breath as if gathering his resolve. "Dad, I came to offer an apology. What transpired it was wrong. Regina and we went too far." I remained silent, scrutinizing his face. Was it genuine regret, or merely a new tactic in their scheme? "Regina's financial difficulties were more severe than we initially believed," Elliot continued when he realized I wasn't going to reply. "They owed a great deal of capital, and the bank was threatening not only to seize the property but to initiate legal action. We panicked and decided to utilize my house and my money to resolve their problems." I finished for him. Elliot lowered his eyes. "Yes, it was wrong. I recognize that now, especially the demand to pay rent, that was unacceptable." "And appropriating funds from my account?" I asked bluntly. "Was that also wrong?" "I didn't appropriate," Elliot raised his head. a familiar spark of resentment in his eyes. I was borrowing. I intended to repay you when circumstances improved. Sir, without my awareness or approval, Elliot, that is termed theft. He clenched his hands on the table. We were in a desperate situation, Father. You'd comprehend if you'd seen Regina weeping nightly, fearing her parents would end up homeless. I had to take action. Action. Yes, I agreed. Like finding them temporary housing they could afford, or assisting them in finding employment, or applying for public aid, but not attempting to drive my own father from his home. I wasn't trying to drive you out, Elliot countered. I wanted us all to coexist as a family. Family. I grinned bitterly. Family doesn't charge a father rent to live in his own house. Family doesn't lock his possessions in the attic. Family doesn't pilfer his money. Elliot was silent, head lowered. When he spoke again, his voice sounded soft and broken. You're right. We committed a terrible act. But you're my father, the only family I have left after my mother passed away.
Can't you forgive me? Gran tu ese a second chance.
Tears glistened in his eyes. And for an instant, I saw in him the small boy Vivian and I had loved so dearly. My heart constricted with sorrow and uncertainty. Perhaps I had indeed treated him too harshly. But then I recalled all the indignities of recent months, all the manipulation, all the falsehoods. And I realized that the man seated before me was no longer that boy. He was an adult who consciously made choices repeatedly, day after day.
Where do you reside now?
I inquired, changing the topic. We rented a small apartment in the city center, Elliot answered. It was costly, but we couldn't locate anything else quickly enough. Regina's parents had gone to her aunt's in Bristol. Lawrence was staying with companions, and Pearl had secured employment in London and relocated there. So, you've all managed to find shelter? I said. Without my assistance. Elliot didn't say anything, likely realizing where I was heading with this.
What do you seek from me now, Elliot?
I asked directly. Why did you come here? He took a deep breath.
I want you to pardon me.
For us to be a family again.
Maybe intime Regina and call return.
Not now, of course. But no.
I shook my head.
You're not coming back to this house. Ever. But Father.
Elliot stepped forward.
You need support. You can't live alone in a house this large after your stroke. A minor stroke, I corrected, from which I've made a full recovery, and I'm managing perfectly well on my own. And if I require aid, I'll employ a nurse or a housekeeper. With what funds? Elliot blurted out, then bit his tongue, realizing he'd revealed too much. That's what it was. I nodded, beginning to comprehend. You're still counting on my money, the property, the inheritance. No, I'm just worried about you, he countered, but without conviction. Elliot. I looked him in the eye.
Ibe ma defai de will.
The house will no longer pass to you upon my death. His face turned pale. What? But to whom, then? To a charity for children with cancer. The same one your mother had been assisting for the last few years. Elliot jumped up from his chair, his face contorted with anger. You cannot do this. I'm your son.
I'm your only child.
I can, I said calmly. And I've already done it. The documents are prepared and notarized. I'll contest it, Elliot threatened. I'll prove that you were incapacitated. You can try. I kept my voice low. Just be warned. If you initiate a lawsuit, I'll confront you in court for financial abuse of an elderly individual. I possess all the proof of how you withdrew money from my account without my awareness. Do you know how the courts handle cases like this?
Elliot froze, contemplating my words.
Then he slowly sank back into his chair.
You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't swear your own son.
You'd be surprised what I'm capable of, I replied after everything that's occurred. A heavy silence settled in the kitchen. Elliot was staring blankly, his shoulders slumped. So, I said finally, you have a choice. Either you accept the situation as it is, and we attempt to rebuild some kind of relationship at a distance, with no shared living and no financial support for me, or you persist in fighting for my property, and then we'll meet in court.
What will it be?
Elliot looked up at me, exhausted. There's no third option where we simply forget the entire matter?
No, I shook my head.
Some things are impossible to erase. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Regina won't agree to the first option. She was relying on the inheritance, the house. Then perhaps you should question if you're with the right person, I stated, if she's prioritizing possessions over family.
You don't understand.
Elliot shook his head. Her family had always been prosperous until that ill-fated venture of her father's. For her, losing her standing, her position, it's the end of the world. And for me, losing respect and trust in my own child is the end of the world, I countered. But here we are, and we must proceed with our lives.
Elliot stood up.
I need to reflect. Discuss it with Regina. Of course, I stood up too. Just remember, if you opt for the legal course, there will be no leniency. I possess proof of your machinations, and I won't hesitate to use it. Elliot headed for the exit, but paused at the door.
You know what's tragic, father?
That things could have been different if you had simply helped us when we requested. I would have helped, I replied. If you'd actually asked instead of trying to deceive me out of my home and funds. That's the distinction, Elliot, and until you grasp it, nothing will change between us. He shook his head and exited without another utterance. I closed the door behind him and walked back into the kitchen, feeling a strange emptiness within. Not regret, no, I was confident I was right. More like sorrow at the realization that some bonds had been severed permanently. 3 months had passed since that day. I hadn't seen Elliot or Regina again, though he'd called a couple of times, brief, awkward conversations in which we both avoided discussing the crucial matters. I learned from shared acquaintances that they'd sold the automobile and relocated to a smaller apartment, and Regina had taken a job at a high-end apparel store. Her family's financial difficulties had apparently been resolved without my intervention. Alfred had found employment in Bristol, and Sheila was teaching French. I was gradually returning to normal. I engaged a landscaper, a young man named Ben, who helped me revitalize the garden. The rose bushes that Vivian had once planted began to revive under his gentle touch. I rekindled old friendships. I began to see Oliver and his wife Margaret regularly, found a couple of former laboratory colleagues with whom I now occasionally played strategy games. In the evenings, I often sat in an armchair by the fireplace with a glass of amber liquid and reflected on existence, on Vivian, on our matrimony, on raising Elliot. Where and when had things gone astray? Was I too strict with him as a child, or was I too lenient? Did I give him sufficient attention, or did professional pursuits always come first? I couldn't find answers to these inquiries. Perhaps they simply didn't exist. Perhaps everyone makes their own choices in life, irrespective of upbringing and circumstances. Elliot chose money and social standing, chose a woman for whom those elements were more vital than human connections. And I couldn't alter his decisions, only my own. One of those evenings, as I sat by the fireplace, observing the flames, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered it. Mr. Thorndyke, an unfamiliar female voice inquired.
My name is Sarah Miller.
I'm from the Foundation for Children with Cancer. Mr. Holt informed us about your intentions regarding the will. Yes, I confirmed.
The house will go to the foundation when it passes.
That's very generous of you, she said. But that's not the sole reason I'm calling. We're launching a new initiative, support groups for seniors who have lost loved ones to cancer, and we require volunteers with personal background. I was wondering if you might be. Yes, I replied before she could conclude.
I'd like to assist.
A week later, I attended my first support group gathering. 6 individuals who had lost spouses, partners, children to cancer. We sat in a circle and spoke of grief, of loss, of how to move forward. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that I was not alone, that there were people who genuinely understood. Returning home after the meeting, I paused at the gate of my house and gazed at it for a long period. A grand Victorian mansion built with so much affection, witness to so many joyful and sorrowful moments. Without Vivian, without Elliot, it seemed too vast for one person. But it was my home, my stronghold, a place where I could be myself without pretense or manipulation. And I realized I had no regrets. Yes, I lost my son, perhaps permanently. But I retained my self-respect, my autonomy, and my dignity. And that, as it turned out, was worth more than familial bonds, if they were based solely on avarice and deceit. I opened the gate and walked down the garden path, past the rose bushes that were beginning to show green after